Good evening, everyone. My name is Jessica Lounsbury, and on behalf of my colleagues in the Office of Alumni Engagement, I would like to thank you for joining us for our final talk with our At Home with Max series, which is generously sponsored by our affinity partner, Manulife. Tonight, we are welcoming Dr. Colin Mang, Assistant Professor in the Department of Economics at McMaster, to discuss the truth about shrinkflation. Before I welcome Dr. Mang, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land on which we learn and work and where this webinar is taking place here on McMaster's campus is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. The territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Just a reminder, this talk is being recorded and you will receive an email with the link to the recording within the next few days. If you would like to turn on the transcript function in Zoom, please click the feature on the bottom corner with the three dots and select transcript, and the transcript should appear for you. The chat function will be open, so feel free to put your comments in there for Colin or myself. And if you have a question for our guest speaker, please type it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will have some time at the end of the formal presentation to answer a few questions. It is now my pleasure to welcome our speaker for the evening, Dr. Colin Mang. Dr. Mang completed his undergraduate studies in economics and history at the University of Toronto and earned his PhD in economics from Lancaster University in the UK. Before joining McMaster University, Dr. Mang worked at Wilfrid Laurier and Toronto Metropolitan University. His research focuses on a variety of economic topics, including technology adoption, earnings and labor market outcomes, international financial flows, and education. So here to discuss the financial and psychological impacts of shrinkflation and how it's quietly reshaping the way we shop, please join me in welcoming Dr. Colin Mang. Colin, over to you.
Well, thank you for having me tonight. It's nice to be here, and good evening to everyone out there who's watching online. So, what we're going to be talking about tonight is shrinkflation. This has been a big topic over the past several years, particularly when we think about the cost of living crisis and the rise in grocery prices for Canadians. Shrinkflation has been part of that. So, what exactly is shrinkflation? What's caused it? And what are the consequences for Canadian consumers? That's what we're going to get into tonight. So, shrinkflation refers to a situation where the size or the quantity of a product decreases. This is a term that we call downsizing. So, you'll see this term show up several times tonight, this idea of downsizing. Uh, what typically happens is that the price stays the same, or even sometimes the price increases. Ultimately, what this means is you pay more for less. You might be paying the same price, but you get less product. Sometimes you end up paying higher prices, but you're definitely getting less product. So we call this shrinkflation. What I'm going to talk about tonight is, first of all, how shrinkflation works. Then we'll also look at why it happens. We'll think about how it affects consumers. We'll also examine some public policy options because there's some interesting things going on in other countries around the issue of shrinkflation and some things that governments here in Canada could consider doing in this policy area. And then we'll also talk about how to spot shrinkflation. As Jessica mentioned, you're welcome to ask any questions just by typing them into the chat feature. We'll have a question and answer session at the end where we can go over anything that you'd like to talk about. So many of you are probably familiar with the term inflation. Inflation simply means that prices are going up for everyday items. And this is a typical feature of the economy. Over time, things become more expensive. There's a variety of reasons for that. Input costs become more expensive. Often it's because labor becomes more expensive. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later tonight. But it's a general feature that we experience that over a long period of time, prices tend to rise. Now, because people are price sensitive and they notice when prices are rising, what businesses will try to do is to avoid increasing what we call the sticker price. of the item. So you can still go to the grocery store, and if you were buying something for $3.99, they want to keep the price at $3.99. The problem is, when faced with increasing costs, they can't necessarily afford to make the same item and sell it at that price anymore. So instead, they will downsize the product, give you a lower quantity at the same price. And this is what we really mean by shrinkflation. Shrinkflation, what it does is it raises the price per unit that customers effectively pay. So shrinkflation is actually a form of inflation because you are effectively paying higher prices if you wanted to buy the same quantity of the good. So it's important to understand that shrinkflation is a component of overall inflation. It's not a separate it's not a separate concept that we examine, but actually shrinkflation is simply contributing to overall inflation. So just as an example of how shrinkflation can happen, well, let's suppose that we have a 500-gram box of cookies and it's selling for $5. Well, what this means for us, if we took our $5 box of cookies and we divided it by 5, that would mean we would be paying $1 for every 100 grams of cookies. Often, when we think about quantities of units, there are standard measures depending on the size of whatever it is we're buying. 100 grams is a typical standard measure that we would think about for many types of grocery items. So, this 500-gram box of cookies, what we're really paying is $1 per 100 grams. Now, let's suppose that the price of the flour or the price of the sugar or the labor that goes into the making the cookies increases. Well, rather than raising the price of the box of cookies beyond $5, because people might not be willing to pay more than $5 for the box of cookies, what the manufacturer could do is they could decrease the size to 450 grams, but still keep the price at $5. Is the change noticeable? Some people would notice it. Some people wouldn't. It's a fairly small decline going from 500 to 450. The box would be about the same size. In fact, they could probably still use the same size box. They're just going to put a few less cookies into the package and just change the weight sign on the outside to read 450 grams. Well, now if they're selling a 450-gram box of cookies for $5, well, if we divide $5 by 4.5, what this really means is that we're now paying $1.11 per 100 grams. So really, by doing this, they've increased the price per 100 grams by 11%. And that's a pretty steep price increase. Even though it would not be a noticeable change in quantity for many consumers, the price per 100 grams has actually risen quite dramatically. And this is how shrinkflation happens. Often, when we see shrinkflation, the reduction in quantity is a bit less than the size that I've shown you today. It's actually much more typical to have a very gradual decrease, where they might decrease by 3 or 4% this year, and then next year decrease a little bit more, and the next year decrease a little bit more. But over time, we could see these size decreases, this idea of downsizing the product, really start to build up over time. And when we think about pricing in standard units, such as per 100 grams, what that leads to is some pretty significant price increases. So I've got just a few examples to show you. So this was taken at a grocery store in British Columbia in 2023, so just a few years ago. And a shopper found both the older and the newer packages still on the shelf. You can see the one on the left is a little bit dented. It's the older package. But what's interesting to note, so first of all, they are being sold for the same price, $7.97. But the newer package has one fewer taquito in it. If we look at the net weight, it went from 595 grams down to 567 grams by going from 21 taquitos down to only 20 taquitos. So this is a very obvious example of shrinkflation. You don't always get to see the same products side by side, but occasionally consumers will notice it at the store and they'll see that the product has been downsized and it'll be smaller going forward. Again, the reason why they do this is because of production costs. And I'll show you some information on production costs a little bit later this evening. But let's take a look at another example. So this one is a bit more recent. This was from a grocery store in Mississauga. And what we see here, the older version on the left has 80 grams in it. The newer version only has 72 grams. So this was a 10% reduction in the quantity that you were getting. That's a pretty steep reduction in the quantity. But I mean, this is what happens with rising production costs. They downsize the product. And notice that the size of the bag is actually still the same. So they didn't shrink the size of the bag, they just changed the number of chips going inside the bag. So you pay the same amount, and if you didn't look closely at the label or you didn't remember what the old size of the bag was, as a consumer, you wouldn't really notice any difference. You would just see the bag is exactly the same size. And if you ever buy chip bags, notice that they're full of air, they're nice and puffed up. So it looks nice and full. And it's got the same, basically the same volume it feels like inside, even though it might be different weights. And then, of course, once you open it and realize how little is in there compared to what you would have seen 5 years ago or even 10 years ago, you realize that the product has been downsized quite dramatically. But this is something that manufacturers do. They will keep the same package size, and that will confuse many customers. The customers won't realize that the product has been downsized. Here's an example of spaghetti. So the older one was 450 grams, and the newer one only 410 grams. So we see the spaghetti being downsized here. You pay the same price, but you just get a little bit less. Well, here's an example with Ritz crackers. So the old package used to be 200 grams, but then it also underwent a 10% reduction down to only 180 grams. Couple of things to notice. So just like with the chip bag, notice that the design of the box changed a bit. This one that only has 180 grams on it was Team Canada Olympics branded. And this is going to be a key thing to watch out for is packaging. Because often when we see downsizing occur, companies will do it along with a packaging update because that also helps to hide the fact that they're downsizing the product because the package itself looks new. Something that consumers haven't really seen before. They think, oh, they've updated the package. This is interesting. And they don't notice the fact that the product has been downsized. Downsizing is not limited to food. So this was an example from Quebec from about a year ago. A shopper had an old bottle of Dawn, and then they found a new one that had been downsized. It went from 479 down to 431. So again, it was almost a 10% reduction that we saw here in the amount of dish soap that you were going to get. So it's a pretty common thing, and it doesn't just affect food items, but it can also affect other grocery items that you would get. Statistics Canada did a study. A few years ago, we had some pretty significant inflation in Canada coming out of the COVID pandemic. You might remember that the years 2022 and 2023, we had significantly higher levels of inflation than we would typically have in a given year. And that was also the case in other developed countries. The United States, the United Kingdom also experienced very high rates of inflation. Even continental Europe had higher rates of inflation than they normally do. And part of that was a result of shrinkflation. And so Statistics Canada looked at this time period specifically, and they studied grocery store products, excluding fruits, vegetables, and unprocessed meats, because you can't really downsize an apple. I mean, it grows on the tree, and your apple's going to be either nice and big or it might be smaller. But for fruits, vegetables, and cuts of meat, you can't really downsize them. They depend on the tree or the animal that they came from. But for processed foods, those types of grocery store products. What they found was that between 2021 and 2023, almost 30% of processed food products and other grocery items experienced shrinkflation. So thinking about boxes of cereal, thinking about bags of chips, or bottles of juice, or and frozen foods. 30% of grocery store products in Canada experience shrinkflation. It's a pretty high amount. Of those, name brand products were much more likely to experience shrinkflation. Of those, almost 78% of the ones that experienced shrinkflation were name brand products. Store brand, or also known as private label products, only about 22% of store brand private label products made up that group of products that experience shrinkflation or downsizing. But this is a pretty significant result. Thinking about that period where we had very high inflation in Canada, a good part of that was being driven by product downsizing. Firms not wanting to raise prices because consumers were very price sensitive, particularly in a period where lots and lots of prices were rising very rapidly. And so they responded by simply downsizing the product, shrinking the amount that they gave you. Well, so this was a rebranding a couple of years ago. So some of you might remember the old Aunt Jemima maple syrup, although it's not really made with maple syrup. It's actually made with cornstarch and uh, corn syrup derivative. But they rebranded as the Pearl Mining Company. And what was really interesting about this is that they changed the shape of the package dramatically. Now, the size of the product shrank. Um, you can see I have here on the side, well, it went from 750 down to 710, but notice the width down here. The old product was shorter, but it was fatter. What they did with the package size was they made the new package much taller. And for a consumer that doesn't pay too much attention, you look at the new bottle and you think, wow, this is actually bigger because it physically looks bigger. But if you look very, very closely at the width, you can see that the old one was a bit wider. And so that even though it was shorter, it had a greater volume, 750 milliliters. The new one, even though it's taller and therefore looks bigger on the shelf, because it's a little bit skinnier, it actually has a lower volume, 710 milliliters. By rebranding the product and making a fairly significant change to the look of the package, they could show or fool many consumers into thinking that shrinkflation had not actually occurred. But this was an example where shrinkflation definitely occurred with this product here. So why does shrinkflation happen? Well, as I mentioned earlier, a big one is cost pressure. Companies are facing rising costs of production from materials, also from labor. Now, you might think, well, the reasonable thing to do if you're facing rising costs is to pass those costs on to consumers and just charge higher prices. And in many types of businesses, that is exactly what happens. But there are certain aspects of consumer behavior, and in particular, cognitive biases that many shoppers have, which means that firms have actually figured out that downsizing products can be less disruptive to their business. That they can trick consumers into thinking that nothing has changed. And so, yes, cost pressures are the driver of why shrinkflation happens. But the reason firms can continue to get away with it is because of cognitive biases among consumers. So we'll talk about both of these this evening. I mean, a main ingredient in many food items is wheat. In Canada, we used to have the Canada Wheat Board, which set the price of wheat, although you could see that it did vary quite a bit. Now, we moved into the free market period in the early part of the previous decade, and you can see that the price of wheat was stable for quite a while up until more recently after the pandemic, where we had a big surge, and the price of wheat has largely come back to where it was in the late 2010s. But still, particularly in the period when shrinkflation was happening, in that 2021 to 2023 period, you can see that there was a large increase in the price of wheat. So when we're thinking about shrinkflation for anything that included wheat, thinking about cereal, thinking about those biscuits that I showed you earlier, this is a strong explanation for why companies were shrinking the size of the product, why they were downsizing, is because they were trying to avoid having to pass this full price increase on to consumers through higher prices for the manufactured food items. Thinking about the price of corn, so thinking about those chips, or even thinking about the syrup, which is derived from corn. So again, similar issue. The price of corn has been generally trending upwards over time. There was a pretty big increase in the early 2010s, and then it came back down. But again, in that 2021 to 2023 period, a pretty substantial short-term increase, which has now fallen off. It's gone back to sort of that, you can see uh, more of its long-term trend, but still continually increasing at a faster pace than the wheat prices increased. And again, this helps to explain why in the more recent period we did see a lot of shrinkflation in things like corn chips, for which the Doritos I showed you earlier are derived from, or from that syrup that I showed you earlier, why manufacturers would face cost pressures that they would try to avoid passing on to consumers by simply downsizing the product. I showed you the chicken taquitos earlier, and yeah, the price of chicken has also been going up. And we saw a sustained increase more recently from 2021 to 2023, and the price has not come back down. Unlike for wheat and corn, where we had a bit of a return to a more normal price, the price of chicken has remained elevated since 2023. And so any producer that's using chicken as an input is going to be thinking about how to downsize their product and use less chicken in it, because the less chicken that they have to give you, the less of this cost increase they need to pass on to consumers. So cost issues are a big component of why this shrinkflation is happening. But of course, one thing that always goes up, generally doesn't go down, at least not for very long, are wages. And if we look at wages in Canadian food manufacturing, they have tended to trend upwards over time at a pretty quick rate. For bakeries, they tend to be lower than meat processors and lower for all food manufacturers as a whole. But you can see that wages in the food processing sector have generally been increasing. And there's only so much of the process that you can automate and use machines. There's still a lot of manual labor that takes place in food manufacturing. And in order to not have to pass on the cost of labor increases, firms will downsize their products so they can stretch their workers out over a larger quantity of items being produced. So, given that firms are facing these cost structure or these cost pressures, I mean, one option is simply to pass them on as price changes. But what we have noticed over time is that consumers are more sensitive to price changes than to quantity or size changes because it's not easy for customers to necessarily notice that quantities have changed, particularly if it's a product that you don't buy all the time. Now, if you're buying a box of cereal over and over and over again, you might notice that the quantity decreases because it's just not going as far. Although, given that you might be pouring slightly different amounts of cereal into your bowl every morning, it might take you a while to figure that out. If you think about a box of cookies, that might, depending on how many kids you have anyway, that might last a long time or it might not last you very long. But it might be harder to notice when you have quantity changes for the product. Price changes are very noticeable, though. When you go grocery shopping and you used to pay $2 for something and now all of a sudden it's $2.49, you notice that you're paying 49 cents more. As a result, consumers are much more attuned to paying attention to prices than they are to quantities. I would bet if I asked a lot of you who regularly go grocery shopping, you could probably tell me how much you paid for the box of cereal. You probably could not tell me the quantity measure that's on the side of the box. Or you could tell me how much you paid for the box of cookies, but you couldn't tell me the quantity measure that's on the size of the box. It's just not something that people consider. And firms have figured this out. Manufacturers realize that they can raise the effective unit price while avoiding the sticker shock issue of having the shelf price increase. So by downsizing, they can trick customers into not realizing that the effective unit price has actually gone up. The reason for this, the reason why consumers are more sensitive to price changes, not to quantity changes, are because of a number of different cognitive biases. So, one of them is what we call price salience or limited attention. And this is just the fact that shoppers pay a lot more attention to price and they don't notice small reductions in quantity that come from downsizing as long as the price stays the same. Because, again, if I asked any of you who regularly go grocery shopping, you probably couldn't tell me the quantity that's on the side of the box. Although I suspect that after this webinar, several of you will go to the kitchen and open up your cupboards and start taking a look at the quantities that are on your boxes of cookies or cereal boxes or boxes of pasta and start making a note of this. It's very easy for people to remember price, but not a lot of people actually pay attention to quantity, and so they don't notice that the quantity changes. Another issue is what we call denominator neglect or unit price blindness, where consumers are just not that great at math. And so they don't actually work out what the price per unit is. I mean, people often have a general idea that if you're buying the large family size box of cereal, it's a better value than if you're just buying the really small box. Or if you're buying the really large box of cookies, it's generally a better value. Like you're paying less per cookie than if you're just getting the little small box. And people kind of understand that, but they couldn't tell you exactly what the price difference is. Uh, People are not accustomed to doing that calculation. And so we call this unit price blindness. And so if you make small changes to the quantity of your product, people don't recalculate. They don't realize what the effective unit price is. And that's why it's easy to change. And that's why downsizing can be easier than switching or than raising the sticker price. Because as long as the numerator stays the same, as long as the sticker price stays the same, people don't think to divide by the quantity to figure out how much they're actually paying. There's also the issue of what we call heuristic-based shopping, where out of habit, people just keep buying the same thing. Many of you probably have preferences over certain types of grocery items, over certain brands of grocery items, and you buy the same things week after week. And you kind of go to the store and you run on autopilot. You're like, oh, I've had this before. I like it. This is what I'm going to get. Or you have a meal plan and you know, okay, I'm going to need these ingredients. This is what I'm going to get. You get the same brands. Many consumers do this. They operate on routine. And if you're doing this, you're less likely to notice that the packaging size has changed, particularly if the downsizing occurs with a redesign of the package. Because you're looking for it, it's still in the same place in the shopping aisle. I mean, this is why it's always a challenge for consumers when you see when stores change their layout. It's always the worst experience when the grocery store changes their layout a little bit and then you don't know exactly where that product that you always get is. You got to go find it again. But if you're always getting the same item from the same place and you see that the packaging has been redesigned, you're like, oh, new packaging. That's great. It's harder to detect modest changes in the quantity because you're just sort of running on autopilot when you go grocery shopping. And this is a cognitive bias that people aren't thinking through their actions fully. They're just based on past experience. They're like, oh, I like this. This is what I'm going to get. Lastly, there's also the issue of what we call psychological price points or left digit bias. And this is why you see so many prices at the grocery store end in 99 or even in 49. And the answer is the reason why this happens is because people look at the number that's on the left. And if you see that it's 4.99, oh, that's better than $5. People don't consider, I mean, 4.99 is $5. But psychologically, people pay more attention to the 4 than the 99. And this presents a problem for manufacturers, for retailers with raising prices. Because if something's 4.99 and all of a sudden you raise it above $5, people will notice because that left digit has changed and that's the one that people pay most attention to. So it can be a much better strategy to downsize your product if you can keep it priced at, for example, 4.99 rather than having to put a 5 as your left digit or even a higher number. Because the larger the left digit gets, the more consumers are going to be turned off by the product. And this is one of the major features why we see people who, or why we see retailers who focus on these smaller products, why we see downsizing, because they want to keep the prices stable and people are less likely to notice because the first thing that they look for is that left digit. So, what are the implications of this for consumers? Well, shrinkflation is a simply less noticeable form of inflation. And so you don't realize that inflation is happening even when it is. Some consumers consider this to be a deceptive marketing practice and think that shrinkflation is unfair, that it would be much fairer and more transparent if businesses simply passed on cost increases to customers. I mean, it would certainly help you as a customer to know that the costs of the business are going up and therefore you have to pay higher prices. But that's not what they try to do. They try to mask the fact that their costs have increased by downsizing the products because then they can sell you less, but you still end up paying the prices you did before. Now, interestingly, Statistics Canada does adjust for package size when looking at consumer goods inflation. So when you see the monthly inflation figures that come out in the middle of each month and you see the consumer price index, those price increases are adjusted for shrinkflation. So even if the sticker price of an item is staying the same, if it has been downsized, the quantity got smaller, that does factor into the inflation calculation. So when you're seeing that increase in the consumer price index and you're seeing the rise in inflation every month, that accounts for any shrinkflation that is happening at the grocery store. Ultimately, this means that consumers are worse off overall because if they wanted to buy the same quantity of the good that they were buying previously, they will have to pay more. So, what could the government do? This is a key question. If we're thinking about this issue of shrinkflation, I mean, there's nothing the government can really do about the fact that costs are increasing for firms, and those costs have to be passed on some way. I mean, that's just a natural feature of what we have to live with. There's nothing the government can do about that, but there have been some ideas about what the government could do to enforce more transparency. So, right now in Quebec, grocery retailers are required to display standard unit prices. That is, for example, prices per 100 milliliters of the good, prices per 100 grams of the good. And that way, as a consumer, you can compare. Okay, last week I was paying $1 per 100 grams for the cookies. This week I'm paying $1.11 per 100 grams for the cookies. Something has happened. Okay, I now understand as a consumer that I am paying more per standard unit. Quebec is the only province that does this. It is voluntary in other provinces, and even here in Ontario, you do see it at major retailers if you look closely enough at the labels. On some products, anyway, at the grocery store, they will provide you with standard unit prices. Next time you're at the grocery store, I would recommend that you take a look at this because then you can also compare different sizes of a product. Like you can take the small, medium, and family size boxes of the cereal, or you can look at like the 1 liter, 2 liter, and 3 liter cartons of milk or some of these other products that come in varying sizes, and they do provide the price per standard units, so you can make that comparison. But in Ontario and in other provinces, it's voluntary, it's not mandatory. And so some consumer advocates have said that what we should be doing is we should be mandating this across Canada. Other countries have actually gone further. So some of the European Union countries have mandated explicit acknowledgement of downsizing. So since 2024, both France and Hungary require labeling in grocery stores for 2 months. So in France, the grocery stores have to relabel the packages to let consumers know that the price has decreased. In Hungary, they have to display a sign that says this product has become smaller. It doesn't actually say that, it's written in Hungarian, but the English translation is the product has become smaller. Uh, and they have to display that next to the product for 2 months. Beginning in April this year, Austria is going to adopt the same model as Hungary, where retailers will have to put a label on the shelf next to the product, indicating that the product has been downsized, and they have to leave it there for 2 months so that as customers come into the stores, they will see that and they will know. Italy has been trying something different. It's actually been delayed since last year because there are some concerns around what the Italians are proposing. Supposedly, beginning in July of this year, we'll see if they are actually able to implement it. They want the manufacturers to label the product for 6 months with it'll be in Italian, but the English translation is this package contains a product that is however many units of measure less than the previous quantity. This has caused some challenges within the European Union because, well, first of all, this is a burden for manufacturers because they've got to change the packaging. And then after 6 months, they have to change all the packaging again. And secondly, Italy is only one country within the European Union. And if a manufacturer has to do this in Italy, then what's the purpose of having two different kinds of packaging for different places? This would effectively require manufacturers to do this for the entire European Union. And then there's some questions over whether Italy has the legal authority to dictate what goes on packages for the entire trading bloc. So there have been some challenges with rolling this out. I think if Canada was to go with this strategy, you would probably face some similar challenges because manufacturers from the United States or Mexico would probably challenge that. Because right now, as long as they meet the English and French labeling standards, they can sell their products here. Having to relabel everything, I think, would be a bit of a challenge. But certainly the French, Hungarian, and Austrian models, where labeling is done at the retail level, either on the product or simply on the shelf, is a very easy thing to do to just put a giant sign next to the product saying, this product has become smaller, just so you know. Would be an easy way to go about showing consumers that this has occurred. So these are some policy options that the government could do. Again, there's nothing they can really do about the cost increases that these businesses are facing, or about the fact that they're likely going to downsize their products in future, but making it a bit more transparent for customers so people realize this is happening would be a good thing for consumers. Now, how do you spot shrinkflation? That's a good question. It's really hard. The most obvious way to spot shrinkflation is to look at when the package has been redesigned. Does the package have new graphics? Does it have a new shape? If yes, shrinkflation has probably happened. Otherwise, though, it's not going to be obvious. I mean, I showed you some examples tonight. The example of the dish soap, the example of the syrup, where the packages were very different in shape and size. I showed you the example of the chips, where it was exactly the same physical size and volume, but they redesigned the look of the package. With the example of the pasta that I showed you, though, if you didn't see them side by side, you wouldn't know because the packaging otherwise looked identical. The same with the taquitos. I mean, the layout, the graphics were identical. The only thing that changed was the numbering on the box because they had less. So often it's not going to be obvious. And as a consumer, what you need to do is you need to check the label and keep track of what you're buying and also what you're paying, because that's really going to be the only way for you to spot some of this stuff over time. So yeah, we are just about out of time for today, but yeah, these were just some of the sources that I had mentioned in the presentation in case you wanted some further reading on the issue of shrinkflation. But yeah, thank you all for coming tonight. I think we've got a little bit of time left for questions.
Yes, we do have a little bit of time for questions. So if you do have a question, please type it in using the Q&A function. And thank you for that very informative and eye-opening presentation. I know I'll definitely be paying closer attention to product sizing and packaging when I go shopping. Just while we are getting some questions submitted here, one question I had was how often do companies downsize? Like, how what's the time space between when they downsize or shrink a product and then potentially shrink it again? Is there a typical time frame that you see that happening?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't happen like on a regular basis. They will likely not downsize multiple times within 1 year. But at a minimum, it will be on an annual basis that they'll consider downsizing. It's often several years in between. Like you might see between a 2 and 5 year time horizon while the cost pressure builds up, and then they reach a point where they need to pass on cost increases over time. As I did show you with those charts. I mean, the costs, other than that brief period, 2021, 23, where we had some pretty excessive increases in some of those underlying input costs, and that led to a lot more inflation and shrinkflation during that period than usual. But otherwise, cost increases are generally pretty gradual. So you're looking on a 2 to 5 year time horizon between incidents of shrinkflation.
Okay, that's great. And kind of on that note as well, how do we as consumers other than starting today after this presentation, keep an eye on that. Is there somewhere you can go and look that this is what the product used to be and this is what it is now? Or is it just kind of paying attention as you go along in your daily shopping?
A, a lot of it is just paying attention. Yeah, watching
Yeah.
out. So there are some journalists that actually keep track of this. CBC Marketplace. They keep track of they go grocery shopping every week. I know some of the journalists on that show because I talk to them from time to time about product input costs because they're constantly looking at that issue from a consumer perspective. So they track prices of a basket of items every week. They go and check out several grocery stores in the Toronto area to keep track of that. But otherwise, there aren't really databases that people are doing this. Statistics Canada again keeps track of some of this stuff for their own purposes, but they don't make that information public. They also go grocery shopping to check all this stuff out and to see what's changing, but that's not publicly available.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. What you can see, I mean, places like Reddit.
Okay.
If anyone's on Reddit, consumers will post what they've seen. If you look at consumer rights blogs or shopping blogs, uh, people will post what they've seen. So that can actually be a good source of this. Like we pick up a lot of this information from the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just paying attention, like as you said, being more conscious of what you're buying, and as you mentioned, checking out those labels on the shelves as well, even though they're so tiny, as one of our viewers said that they're hard to see.
Yeah.
um, One of our viewers is asking, when production costs go back down, do firms undo their shrinkflation? For
Mm.
example, if there's an increased quantity in packages again, or do they keep the reduced quantity and increase their profit margins?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. When I was putting this together, the answer is occasionally yes. Looking at the pasta example. So the size of the or the amount that you get in the pasta actually does to some extent depend on the price of wheat. And I showed you an example of shrinkflation, but then the pasta package actually got a little bit bigger again when the price of wheat went down. So yes, it is possible. It's not typical. I mean, once it shrinks a little bit, what you will often see over a long period of time, because I mean, we've had a lot of shrinkflation more recently. This is typically, as I mentioned, a much longer term phenomenon. So firms will shrink a bit, shrink a bit, shrink a bit, and then they'll come out with a new, larger size, which they'll charge a higher price for, but then they'll start the process over again. They might even phase out the smaller one again. So now they'll put them side by side on the shelf for a little while. So you'll have that one that has shrunk down a bit and still has the lower price. Then next to it, they'll put a new, bigger package which has a higher price, and then that signals people, oh, I'm getting more. Oh, I'm willing to pay the extra dollar for that one. I'm willing to pay $5.99 instead of $4.99 now. And then they phase out the 4.99 one. You're left with the 5.99 bigger one, but then they start downsizing it over time too, and eventually you end up back in the same situation. So that's sort of the longer term strategy with shrinkflation and how businesses manage that is by constantly changing the product sizes. At some point, you start the process over again with a new larger size.
And kind of on that note too, one of our viewers is asking, isn't the redesign of the packaging expensive as well? So I assume that if they're doing it, it might be a less expensive option for them.
Yeah. So redesigning of the packaging is not necessarily an easy thing to do, particularly when you have multiple language requirements, as you do in Canada. So this is why it is a bit like the Italian regulation that I mentioned earlier is quite burdensome for manufacturers to have to be updating their package quite regularly. Now, if a business is trying to hide the fact that they're downsizing, it makes sense to redesign the package. And if they're going to be using that redesigned package for quite a while, if they're going to be using that for a year, like that's fine. But yeah, you wouldn't want to be constantly redesigning the package over and over again. And there is some like brand equity that you build up in the package if it's really recognizable, if people know exactly what they're looking for when they go to the store, even if it's moved to a different shelf or to a different section in the store. Um, there is brand equity in your current design. So firms are hesitant. And as I showed you some of the examples today, it was exactly the same design. They just changed the number on the side because they didn't want to redesign the packaging.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, on that on that note, how does shrinkflation influence our perception of value and brand loyalty? Um, is a risk of damaging reputational damage if by shrinking products? Is there any evidence towards that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. So that goes back to the cognitive biases that I showed you earlier, and I can put back up the just the references again in case people want to take a look at
Sure.
some of these. But in terms of reputational damage, the reputational damage from shrinkflation is less than from increasing prices. And that's the key thing. I mean, firms are going to take a hit either way. If they raise the price, people are going to be unhappy. If you downsize it and people notice that it's been downsized, they're going to be unhappy. But fewer people are going to notice the downsizing than are going to notice the price increases. So you think about the trade-off in terms of happy versus unhappy people. Raising your prices makes more people unhappy. Downsizing makes a smaller number of people unhappy. So that's why they choose downsizing over price increases generally.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, one of our viewers is asking, and it's an interesting question. So she's asking what to watch for shrinkflation when consumers eat out at diners or fast food restaurants where you're not typically given the sizing info. What are some things that you can look for there? There's a lot of grocery store examples, but is there anything that we could keep our eye on when eating out or at fast food restaurants?
Yes, so that's a really good question because yeah, restaurants face the same types of pressure. Now, for many fast food restaurants, they are kind of stuck because like this, you can't make the size of a quarter pounder less than a quarter pound of beef, right? I mean, that is what they're selling you. What you might get though is more filler item in the meat.
Right.
So marginal reduction in the amount of beef that's in the patty, and that's how they can sort of pass it on. It's still the same weight, but you change the composition a little bit. It's really, really hard for consumers to notice those kinds of changes. Um, Now you might see the sizing for like your box of fries get
Hmm.
just a little bit narrower, or you might notice the size of your soft drink cup just get a little bit narrower or a little bit shorter. Although they tend not to do that with soft drinks because soft drinks cost them almost nothing. It's just sugar and water, and water costs almost nothing. They usually want to sell you soft drinks because that's their highest margin item. Uh, but yeah, it's really, really hard to tell with fast foods because the quantity, the size, I mean, they've usually committed to that over time. And so they can't really do a lot with that. You're much more likely to see price increases when they're facing cost increases than to see quantity sizes. Although there was the incident, oh, I guess it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. You might remember that the Competition Bureau started measuring, um, they started measuring Subway sandwiches, and they
Mm.
found that they were less than 12 inches. That the bread it was actually now it was coming out to only 11 and a half inches, and they actually did shrink it, and then they forced them to go back to 12 inches, and it was probably about 8 years ago, I think. The Competition Bureau, 8 or 9 years ago, because it was before the pandemic. But the Competition Bureau started going to bars and measuring pints of beer.
Hmm.
Because what they were finding is that you weren't getting 20 ounces, that often you were getting like 19 ounces. And so they stopped making, so bars had to either start serving 20 ounces or stop calling them pints of beer. Uh,
Right.
because, yeah, if it's not going to be 20 ounces. And yeah, so the government has done that from time to time, measuring products to see if what they're advertising is actually what they're providing to you.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So again, just paying attention to those maybe menu items and sizes of items when you purchase them. Yeah, it sounds like it's a constant thing to keep track of. We'll take some time here for maybe two more questions before we wrap up for the evening. So, one of our viewers is saying, "Thank you for the presentation.
Uh,
What is the tipping point for downsizing products? Chips are the prime example for me. Bag sizes have shrunk significantly over the past several years. At what point do manufacturers decide to stop shrinking and try changing inputs, taking into account research costs to ensure minimal flavor changes, etc., or rising prices?" It's a bit of a long question, but
Oh
I
no,
can
that's
repeat
okay.
it.
That's a really good question. So first of all, on the changing inputs, so you will see manufacturers, um, particularly for chips, experiment with different types of cooking oil
Mhm.
to see what they can do if they can get a different kind of cooking oil and still get the same type of flavor. Then it may make sense for them to change the input. There's not really a lot when you're making chips. I mean, you can either make chips out of potatoes or you can make them out of corn. And depending on what brand you're making, I mean, like you don't have a choice. Like if it's a potato chip brand, you gotta stick with potatoes. If it's a corn chip brand, you gotta stick with corn. But yeah, they will experiment with like different types of oil or with different, slightly different measures of the seasoning to see if they can get it to taste right. And um, there's not really a lot they can do with that. In terms of what the threshold is, again, that's what I mentioned before is like once it becomes too small and it's obvious that consumers aren't going to be interested in a product that's gotten too small, they will introduce a new larger size and then start the process over again.
Mm.
And then slowly downsize from the larger size. So that's typically what you see. Yeah, I mean, we're at a period now. The chip bags have gotten probably about as small as they can get. So I think you'll probably see over the next couple of years new, larger sizes coming out, and
Interesting.
then the process can start again. If you think about like they've got like the really small grab and go bags, and
Yep.
then you go to like what's called the party size bag, the really large ones, but you can now sometimes get an intermediate size
Mm.
in between the grab and go or the party size. And yeah, eventually that'll just switch over to becoming the grab and go, something a little bit smaller, and then shrinkflation will continue with that. In terms of what the threshold is, it's kind of on an item for item basis. Different items at different price points are going to have different thresholds. Things which are cheaper, they'll be able to get away with a little bit more shrinkflation because the product already has a very, very low price. Um, but if the product's already like a bit more expensive, there will be a limit to how small they can make it because if you make it too small and the price is already quite high, like if you're paying $6, $7 for something, you want to feel like you're getting $6 or $7 from it. It's very different than if you're buying something for $2 or $3.
And just one more question here, in the essence of time that we're going to wrap up shortly here, but kind of based on what you're just talking about, one of our viewers said, "I have heard with shrinkflation that the quantities can become too small and then be subject to sales tax. Is this correct? Do you know what the quantity weight criteria is for
Hmm.
various products?"
So that's a really good question. Yeah, because it's important to understand that sales tax only applies to food grocery items if they are snack size, basically. Anything that is large quantity, meal size. This is also why, like, if you go to the donut shop and you buy a dozen donuts, there's no sales tax on that because it's a large food quantity. Uh, yeah, whereas if you buy the individual one, there's sales tax on it because snacks have sales tax on it. Exactly what point it hits that, I don't know exactly what the gram size has to be. There is probably a measure that is specified in the Excise Tax Act, which lays out what all the sales taxes are. I'm not actually aware exactly what that threshold is, or it might differ from one product to another depending on the nature of the product as well. That is a good question, but you should be able to look it up in the Excise Tax Act, or in the regulations associated with that. Uh,
Okay, that's great. Lots of information to think about. I know next time I go grocery shopping, it might take a little while longer as I view all the packaging and labeling on the shelves. So, Dr. Mang, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to speak to us this evening. We really appreciated it, and that was very informative. And thank you to all of you who tuned in online to watch. As mentioned, this webinar was recorded, and we'll share the recording within a few days to all those who registered. You'll also be receiving a follow-up survey immediately following the webinar. If you could take a minute to fill it out, we would greatly appreciate it. It helps us plan for our future programming here at the Alumni Engagement Office. And if you're interested in our future alumni events and programming, please visit alumni.mcmaster.ca/events, and you'll find a complete listing there. So once again, thank you to all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Mann, for your very informative presentation, and we hope you all enjoy your evening.